Very, very good. I must confess, I mean, the 69 trip on Dubon, 74 this trip, I had to go back. I went back on, I don't know, 3, maybe 4 other trips to the same area, different paths across the same country. John McInnes, who lives in Edmonton and has explored a lot of waterways around Great Slave Lake and so on. It's always a pleasure to hear him tell us stories about the sort of the dual little routes instead of these big one river kind of trips. Are we ready there? Is it turned on? Are you on, John?
I think I'm on now. So I'm on. That's good. I've been here before, but I never remember the sunglasses for the photographer. I thought a little bit when I was sitting there the first time George let me come up here and talk about obscure rivers that no one had ever heard of. And I'm glad to be here today, assuming that in the past 15 years attendance has recovered sufficiently that he's going to let me do it again. My presentation today is about 2 Clichon trails, old trails to the Barren Lands. They linked the north arm of Great Slave Lake with the Barren Lands to the northeast. Most of the trips you'll hear about in the Northwest Territories focus on the dramatic mountain rivers west of the Mackenzie or on the great rivers of the Barrens to the east. You'll be depressed to know that this is not one of those presentations. These traditional routes take place in this area highlighted here. They extend from the north arm of Great Slave Lake north and east towards the Barrens. They're rather unlike most of the more popular canoe routes in the territories. Let's consider what attributes might make a popular recreational canoe route. Lakes are a lot of work. Current is very helpful. Runnable rapids are a lot of fun. And we are sure that even Bill Mason didn't like portaging. But if we stop to consider what made a good traditional canoe route before the invention of the twin otter let you fly one way, we might need to revisit these criteria. In the traditional world, lakes are good because they paddle the same upstream and downstream. Similarly, still water beats continuous current. Runnable rapids, no thanks. Actually, short, steep drops are good because they minimize the portaging distance required for a given elevation gain. And finally, the dog rib were never afraid of portaging. A good traditional route needs one last and most important attribute, and that's a reason to travel it. These routes had the best reason of all, which was caribou. Let's take a closer look at the country these routes traversed. So to orient, at the very bottom there, we have Great Slave Lake and its north arm. We have Marion and Russell Lakes, which are essentially extensions of the north arm of Great Slave, and the fur trade post of Fort Ray, subsequently the community of Ray Edzo, and now known as Betcho-Con. In July, the annual treaty ceremonies and gathering took place at Fort Ray. After the ceremonies and the socializing were over, the dog rib had an important job to do. They had to travel northeast to the tree line, which we'll show there in green, to meet the southward moving herds of caribou. In mid-August was the time that the caribou hides were primed for clothing. To gather those hides was the principal reason behind this hunt, but the hunters could also bring bales of dry meat back to their waiting families. No twin otters, so by canoe there were essentially 4 principal routes from Fort Ray that ran to the Barrens and to the Caribou. The first left Fort Ray through Marion Lake and followed the Marion and then the Emile rivers northward to reach tree line around Mesa Lake. The Emile is a classic pool and drop river, and it's well suited to this kind of upstream travel. The second was the Snare River route. It left through Russell Lake and proceeded only intermittently along the Snare River on its way to Snare Lake. Oh, that was a bad thing. From where it would continue into the Barrens at Winter Lake. Before it was dammed for hydro after the Second World War, the Snare was the most tumultuous and the largest river that flowed south into Marion and Russell Lakes. And many detours away from that river were made to avoid its rapids. The 2 routes I want to concentrate on today, first one called the Small River route. It also left from Russell Lake, but followed a small stream north to its headwaters and then a portage into Ghost Lake. From there, lakes and connecting portages would take you to Snare Lake, and then it would continue on to the Barrens at Winter Lake. And second and finally, a route called Montfuis Trail, which followed the Wecho River north and east from Russell Lake before leaving it for a chain of small lakes and connecting streams. This trail crossed the Yellowknife River at Lower Carp Lake and continued northeast to reach the Barrens here around Grizzle Bear Lake, just a little bit southeast of Winter Lake. From there, this trail could be continued south and east to Jolly Lake, which is at the headwaters of the Lockhart River, and then north to reach the Coppermine River just above Lake Providence. These trails were used for centuries as part of the annual cycle of Dene life. They continued to be used through the first half of the 20th century, even up to the 1960s in some cases. But they gradually fell into disuse as the bush plane became the preferred transportation method for the fall hunt. Not only did aircraft reduce the time and the labor involved in travel, but they made it possible to find the caribou more quickly and to bring back fresh meat from the hunt, which was a more important consideration now because store-bought clothing and canvas had mostly replaced the need for caribou hides. While they faded out, these trails have experienced a sort of rebirth since 1992. In that year, the Dog Rib Treaty 11 Council implemented a program called Trails of Our Ancestors. This program involved high school students, leaders, and elders paddling the traditional canoe routes between the Dog Rib communities to attend the annual Dog Rib Summer Gathering. It focused on allowing the students to gain an appreciation of traditional life on the land. In the 2 decades since that began, many of these traditional routes have been rediscovered. I want to make it clear that they aren't rediscovered by me. John B. Zoe of the Treaty 11 Council and Tom Andrews, who is the territorial archaeologist based out of the Prince of Wales Centre in Yellowknife, have provided me with most of the information that I'm now providing to you. If you're a Veteran Symposium attendee, you might remember that both Tom and John B. spoke here in 1999 and described these old trails and the Ancestors program. Okay, let's take a closer look at the Small River Trail. and small here is not an exaggeration. This stream leaves Russell Lake at the bottom via the Busso River, but soon abandons it for a small drainage that it will follow north so that you can portage from its headwaters into Ghost Lake. Starting in Russell Lake, Russell is a large, shallow, sprawling lake. It's filled with islands and with good campsites. As you head upstream, initially the small river is a placid stream. It winds between willow-covered clay banks. But soon you encounter its first rapid and a lengthy portage around a rocky gorge. Above here, the small river flows over the rugged surface of the Canadian Shield. Now, as a river, this little stream isn't much. In its river sections, it tends to be too steep, narrow, and shallow to offer much in the way of paddling. In some places, it becomes extremely narrow, and in another place, it becomes extremely shallow. But these failings as a river don't mean that it's a failure as a canoe route. The land across which the small river runs is a weathered, faulted, fractured plain of ancient bedrock, and it's host to a myriad of small lakes. It's these lakes that are the key to the small river trail. They lie in between its unnavigable rapids, and they offer the paddler easy progress, and in places a certain intimate charm. There's relief from this after a short portage over a sandy ridge into the west end of Ghost Lake. It offers the traveler some 35 kilometers of easy paddling. That's a welcome change by now. Once you reach the northern tip of Ghost Lake, to continue north, you find that the character of the land changes. The lakes are now larger, and the portages between them somewhat longer. In this stretch, the trail up the Snare River, shown here in yellow, which is, as usual, not on the Snare River, rejoins the small river trail in Cotterill Lake just before the last portage into Snare Lake. This is the sort of terrain batteries. Oh, is this thing?
Oh, no, I think they'll get rid of that.
Okay. Sorry. This is the kind of terrain that can make you wonder, if this is a canoe trip, why am I so far from the water? Still, you can tell that this was a major trail by how well the old portages still stand out. And as you go along from time to time, you'll run across remnants of older travel. This is an old, large freighter, which I'm personally glad I wasn't carrying. Still, it's a real relief and a good feeling to cross the final portage and to see the waters of Snare Lake stretching away into the north and the east. From here, most of the work is done. Travel to the Barrens through Snare, Round Rock, and Winter Lakes is quite easy. This series of lakes offers you over 100 kilometers of straightforward paddling with only 4 short portages. The north shores of Snare and Round Rock Lake are, for the most part, beautiful open parkland. And along them you'll see the remnants of old cabins and old graves that show the traditional use. Just before the last portage to Winter Lake, there's another historic artifact on a sand plain to the north of the river. This rock and antler cairn, left by the archaeologist Tim Losey in 1970, marks the site of Sir John Franklin's Fort Enterprise, the winter base for his ill-starred first expedition of 1819 to 1821. After making that last portage, you can climb to the peak of an island in Winter Lake and look eastward into the Barrens. You've reached the end of the Small River Trail. Our second trail today will be Montfouil's Trail, the great boat trail to Jolly Lake and beyond. But before we look at the trail in detail, let's try and answer the question, who was Montfouil and how did he get a canoe route named after him? Well, this is Montfouil. He was chosen as the chief spokesman for the Dog Rib when they negotiated Treaty 11 with the Canadian government at Fort Rae in August of 1921. During those discussions, Montfouil defined the Dog Rib's traditional land use area, as is outlined on this map. That's the dark, sort of turnip-shaped piece of land, and obviously a huge range with which these people were familiar. This formed in large part the basis for the negotiation of the Dog Rib's modern land claim agreement that was signed in 2005. Montfouil's Trail also leaves from Russell Lake. It does so on the Wetcho River, following it upstream through Mosher and Inglis Lakes to Wheeler Lake. From Wheeler Lake, it abandons the Wetcho and follows a small stream, small streams being rather a theme here, east to Germain Lake. The ascent of the Wetcho is not easy going. You gain over 100 meters in elevation between Russell and Wheeler Lakes. Large falls, small ledges, and longer series of rapids are frequent obstacles. From the east end of Wheeler, you leave the Wetcho to find an ancient trail through the muskeg. This and a small stream lead you to Germain Lake and the beginning of the next section of Montfouil's Trail. That section is a little obscure, and not just because Google Earth leaves clouds on it. You can travel from the bottom, just where you leave Germain Lake, north and east for 4 days until you portage into the Yellowknife River at Lower Carp Lake. And in that time, you will not pass through a stream or a lake which is dignified by a name on your map. But after a stiff climb out of Germain Lake, up a rock ridge that is the east shore, you come to a beautiful little lake and a great relief at this point. And north of it, you're in another small stream, almost like a canal in places, that leads you north into its headwater lakes and your portage into the Yellowknife River. Once you've got on the Yellowknife River, you're somewhere that's too well known, so it's important to leave that immediately. From Lower Carp Lake, you portage east into Frodsham Lake, and then continue through a chain of lakes, Boulder, Squalus, and onwards past Thulezeth. North of Boulder, you also get to paddle up yet another small stream. In Frodsham Lake, there's sign of old use that isn't entirely traditional. The Geological Survey had been prospecting through here in 1937. The portage out of Frodsham is a long climb up a rocky ridge. But at its end, you find yet another small lake that leads you on towards the north. North of Boulder Lake, Montfouil's Trail ascends another small stream. Initially, it's uncharacteristically boisterous, But above this rapid, it's back to being a nice, placid stream that winds and takes you northward to Thulezeth Lake, passing through a beautiful traditional campsite in Squalus Lake on the way. You're now getting fairly close to the Barrens. As you leave Thulezeth, there's a lengthy portage, and then a couple of more short portages and small lakes take you to Grizzlebear Lake. Some might recognize that name from Franklin's first journal. At Grizzlebear Lake, you're essentially on the edge of the Barrens. But Montfou's Trail can be continued through Drymeat Lake and into the headwaters of the Snare River. They can be followed upstream to Jolly Lake, which is at the headwaters of the Lockhart River. And beyond there, you can follow Jolly's drainage east to Courageous Lake, and then take a very conveniently placed chain of small lakes all the way north to the Coppermine River. Grizzlebear is really an attractive lake. It's nearly barren. It's surrounded by a lot of beautiful beaches and eskers. On the north shore of Grizzlebear, you find more old graves that show this was once a homeland as well as a canoe route. In the headwaters of the Snare, you're in yet another small river. It often has a few more rocks than it does water. You may sometimes wonder what you're doing there. So apparently do the local wildlife. This was a very bemused and curious wolf that I met there. Carrying on, it's a pleasure, carrying on really quickly, carrying on more slowly at the prescribed 3 miles an hour. It's a great relief to come over the last portage from the Snare headwaters into the open water of Jolly Lake. Here, too, you can find the traces of old camps that speak of traditional caribou hunting. Getting to the Coppermine from here, it's really quite easy. Mostly you're making fairly short portages across open ground, although it's occasionally very boulder-strewn ground. A few days more of perseverance, and the Coppermine River is there at the end of the trail. If luck is with you, you may find the caribou are there to greet you. Well, that's 2 trails, and that's probably more than enough for today. So I hope you've enjoyed traveling these old trails with me. I think that importantly that they're not just canoe routes, but they are testaments to the incredibly detailed knowledge of their homeland that the old Dog-Rib Dene had. I would defy you to find these routes on a map. They are not obvious at ground level. They're not obvious in satellite photos. They're not obvious on modern topographic maps. How they were originally discovered and refined over decades and centuries must be a story of many years and much effort. As modern travelers, we may be able to follow in the footsteps of these old dog ribs, but I have my doubts that we could fill their shoes. Thanks very much. Thank you, Bill.